Take it
All
away.
right. That's all right. I'm just going to remind folks, here at the start of what I was talking about, just kind of give a summary about that. And really what I'm talking about is this issue of wonder, of wonderment, and of wondering out loud. At least that's sort of one framework of this. So as you saw the talk, I ask, why aren't we asking aliens questions? And to summarize the three main points in a slightly different way, we humans do ask questions of each other. It's part of who we are, it's part of our being, it's part of our becoming. And yet we rarely ask questions of ETI. And so I finally conclude and sort of open-endedly say, what kinds of questions would we ask? Now, during this talk, of course, there's some interstitial material. In particular, at the very beginning, I asked everyone, what's the most significant piece of pop culture that depicts our field, astrobiology? I also mention and don't dwell on the fact that there are various complications. Language itself is certainly a complex affair. And so what kinds of contexts and subtexts do we need to understand as we are asking questions of each other, and of course of ETI? And again, when asking any kinds of questions, what are the dangers in asking questions at all? Under the second heading, I gave various examples. It didn't take me too long to give the examples that we have of existing MEDI practice in asking questions. And yet it seems to me that we do know how to ask at least some types of questions, that in fact, a lot of the early theory around MEDI in the early 60s involved being able to ask some kinds of questions and to enter into this kind of dialogue. So I really want to dwell in this Q&A, in this discussion period, not about the earlier topics. I don't want to discount them entirely. I do want to address them if they come up. But I would like to focus myself on this third piece. What kinds of questions would we ask ETI? And the examples that I gave in the presentation include the fact that children ask questions. So what kinds of questions do children ask? We can get inspiration from the kinds of questions people ask when they become first acquainted with each other or seek romantic partners, right? The questions we memorialize in the Haggadah and Plato and in many other texts that have survived over centuries. What kinds of questions do people ask each other when they're attempting to find a common mode of communication? What kind of questions do language learners ask of each other when they're trying to find something common? And also when people find themselves in unfamiliar situations in foreign countries, for example, what kinds of questions do people need to ask, right? So these are the kinds of questions that ways that we might approach this, but certainly there are many other kinds that I didn't present in 15 minutes and that I'm sure that you have thought about as well. And of course, there's the question of what kinds of questions should we not be asking, coming back to the potential danger. I guess I also want to point out that, the title of my talk is why aren't we asking aliens questions? And really, I meant that, this gets back to the different functions of questions. I meant that personally in a rhetorical kind of way. Although if someone wants to address the danger issue, that's implicit in this title as well. So that's really what the talk was about in summary. And I would love to talk about these issues some more together.
Okay, sounds good. If you would, William, will you stop sharing your screen?
Sure.
But I see Neil, you've already got your hand up. So Neil?
Yeah, I just got a basic question, and maybe it's for linguists, for philosophers of language, because I don't know how any of this works, but if you're trying to communicate with somebody who has no language base to start with you, does it take more work to get up to the point where you can ask questions as opposed to the point where you can assert propositions? It seems to me it's got to be a lot easier to transmit the value of pi, 3.14159, blah, 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 than to ask any question. And so maybe it just might be, we might be putting up a much harder task for ourselves to try to communicate using questions rather than assertions.
Sure. Yeah. As a practical matter of asking questions, which I think, actually, that's one of the main concerns that our next presenter has, that Douglas Estes has, right? Not only the content of the questions, but the manner in which we're even recognized to be asking questions at all. I would go back to looking at again, those early examples of Linkos and Astroglossa. And it's rather early on in Linkos where the interrogative gets introduced. And it's in the context, well, okay, so Hans Freudenthal, of course, was primarily and foremost a mathematician. And he was interested in the teaching of mathematics. So when he presented Linkos, yes, initially he was presenting a kind of language of mathematics. This is the symbolism that we use for addition and other mathematical operations. But then relatively early on in his first chapter, he introduces the idea of a variable that is a way of depicting, here is an expression, and now we have an unknown, and we want to know what the unknown is. So, I, when we looked at cosmic call, that I showed very briefly an image and then an English language translation of cosmic call, that's the same kind of question that we're able to at least initially ask rapidly, right? So we do need to make some statements to present a sort of common thread, a common channel, a way of saying things. But soon after making statements, it is possible to ask questions, at least in the somewhat limited sense of saying, solve for X. Okay. And then, of course, Freudenthal ramps that up, and solve for X starts to take on almost a kind of moral stance, because his idea of language is that it ought to be able to embrace the full, it ought to be able to express the full range of human language.
All right, John?
Yeah, I actually thought this was a really interesting idea. It struck me that it is interesting that we don't ask questions, but when you think about when you travel, when you go to another country, you don't walk into the, wherever you are and begin saying, let me tell you all about myself, unless you're kind of a jerk. The thing you do at the beginning is ask lots of questions. But what's also interesting is there are questions we wouldn't ask of ET, like, where's the bathroom? And so how do we find the sort of where's the bathroom level of questions to ask ET?
I don't know. I guess what I'm proposing here is that I don't know what the questions are that we should ask ETI. I just am stating that this is what we do as humans, as you said, John, right? When we find ourselves in a new place. And this is a reflection of our intelligence. This is just so intimately tied into who we are. And again, as you state, you don't walk into a party and just say, hey, here's who I am, right? And never try to find out about the other person. So because this is the way that we behave towards each other, because this is the way intelligences behave towards each other, social beings who want to be social with others behave towards each other, we ought to ask questions. I don't arrive to a party, well, maybe I would if it were a real dire case, and immediately ask, where's the bathroom, right? But you're right, the equivalent of that would be something that we would need to ask. And I personally don't know what that is. Maybe someone, I'm not following along in chat, but maybe someone has a proposal for what kinds of questions we would ask.
Well, my point is that when you go to a foreign country, for one thing, you often don't have language skills. So you wind up only asking very, very basic questions like, where's the bathroom? Where's the train station? That kind of thing. They're very factually oriented questions. The other thing I think that your idea points out is that in doing that, or when you go to a party, you know, and you're asking questions, actually what that gets at is a basic humility. And what I thought your presentation raised is a sort of, in a sense, a sort of arrogance with which we've pursued the Medi part of this project, where we're going to send out messages and tell people about ourselves. But that's actually a pretty arrogant approach to things. And it doesn't really convey a sense of humility, which actually being kind of arrogant might actually be kind of dangerous too. But I thought what your idea really gets to is that we often begin relations with those we don't know with a sense of humility. And then as we get to know them, we start conveying more. And a question is part of a humility.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with the notion of humility versus sort of hubris or arrogance as being important to the talk. And it's not only when you first meet someone. Getting very personal, I had a very difficult conversation with my father over the weekend around how he handles his finances, and he believes he's this world's expert. And in the end, I realized that he wasn't really interested in asking questions or having me ask questions. He just wanted to assert. He just wanted to state. He just wanted to, yell out those digits of pi. And I thought that wasn't going. We weren't going to reach common ground. We weren't going to learn from each other in that kind of way.
Okay, Sherry?
So I was thinking about this last night a lot because as a language teacher / linguist, I mean, that is one of the things that we do first is we teach people how to get their needs met. And so I was thinking, okay, so first off, you've got two kinds of questions. You've got the yes, no questions, which are basically you present a proposition and you go yes, no, which is easy to motivate in Linkos, right? It's the equals, not equals. Is this right? Is this not right? And then there's what you were saying about developing a set of variables. So you ask a question which is the same as please fill in X, which is the who, what, when, where, why questions. And then I was thinking that, of course, the other problem is to ask a question, you need all the nouns and verbs that go into the question. So maybe the answer to your question is not what do we ask, but what can we ask? So what words can we teach in our Linkos style message? And that might be the way that that what curtails the kinds of questions we can ask is just what words do we have? So if we can do something like the Arecibo plaque or the Arecibo message and say something like this is our world and then interrogative sign. So I think maybe the first things we can do are say things about ourselves and go, and you? And what about you? And I think to making the statement is, in this case, not as humble to do it first, but maybe necessary as we're kind of laying down what our language is going to be like as we talk with one another. Yeah,
it's a kind of humility, I think, also as well. It's the humility of the dog who meets the other dog, and they do some sniffing around, right? But then the dogs will show their bellies towards each other, right? There's a kind of vulnerability. So we are revealing things about ourselves, but now we want to know also about you, right?
Right.
And
right, it's that cool reciprocity that you get where I'm not just asking you questions, which could be sort of intimidating, right? But I'm saying I'm offering information about myself and then offering you the chance to offer the same information about yourself. And then you can always end the message with a big generalized question mark, right? Like, well, what else do you want to say?
Right, and my reading of the cosmic call message is I think what you're proposing, Sherry, right? This notion of here's how many of us there are, here's what our planet's qualities are in terms of numbers, and then there's this big sort of question mark, big variable, yeah. And you, yes.
Yeah, exactly. I think this is a really cool paper. I really enjoyed the presentation. Thank you.
Okay, Catherine.
Yeah, thank you, William, because it's a really, really interesting paper and an interesting question. I think having worked with the SETI community for a long time, I know that the standard argument that's made for just as John just mentioned, for example, just blasting the Google servers into space, the idea of just a really massive outpouring of data from us straight to them, as I'm sure you realize, is it's just logistics. It's because of the vast reaches of space and time, blah, 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 right? And it's just the idea that, it's completely inefficient to just send a short quantity of information with a question and then wait centuries and centuries, if not longer, for an answer. So it's about efficiency. And it's also about the idea, which I think John, I'm kind of foreshadowing John's paper, but the idea that, well, the aliens are so much smarter than us that they're just going to be able to figure it out. If we send them all the data, then they, as the more advanced, get to take on the burden of figuring out how to talk to us, right? So I was just wondering, I mean, you didn't address that explicitly in your paper, so I wanted to hear your thinking on that.
Sure, right. So, right, there certainly are logistical time delay problems here. And I guess there are two ways that I've been thinking about that. One is, yes, in terms of the vast space, the long time delay. It doesn't seem like even if we were to ask a question, we would get any kind of response in any reasonable time. But nevertheless, the act of asking the question does the kinds of things that we've been talking about so far in the discussion period, the Q&A, the sort of, but our intelligence is such that these are the frontiers of our knowledge. This is what we know, and this is what we're willing to express about ourselves, but we don't know other things. And can you tell us about these other things that we don't know, right? To me, when I teach a class, there's always this issue of where's the frontier of the knowledge? Where does any individual student, where's that zone of proximal development, right? What do they know and what do they not know? And let's identify that, because that's where we can work. And if we ask questions, and if we ask carefully wrought questions, then we're able to identify to ETI, this is what we're curious about, this is what we know, and this is what we'd like to find out. So I think it reveals more about ourselves than simply a data dump does, which shows us the limits, but not the direction that we want to be headed in. The second thing is for, I don't know what the technological limitations will be in a century or a millennia, but we should be prepared to ask questions because being prepared to ask questions helps us to, for example, develop the language that we need so that we can ask those questions. And it also helps us to consider, why are we doing this at all? I think there's a lot of implied, we're sending out many, and then among us scholars, there are conversations about whether or not we ought to do it and why we're doing it. But I think that it becomes more public, the reasons that we are doing this, if we publicly say that we are also sending these questions. Then I think that the general world, and not just this tight little scholarship that we have, this tight community that we have, the general world will I think, more fully understand what it is that we're doing when we ask questions.
Thanks.
Okay, Eric Hughes, you got time for a real quick question.
Oh no, a really quick question. Okay, I think it was David Denier who suggested an alternative way of showing humility and not being a bore, namely to, instead of sending information about us, send information about them. So if we identify a star system and send a message to that star system, we send the data we have on that star system. Of course, that is also a double-edged sword. It could be like conceived as a threat if we're unlucky, but that would be an alternative solution.
That's very interesting. Yes, to say this is what we know about you. What more can you tell us? I mean, you don't want to sort of be seen as a stalker. Like, this is what I already know and about you, or seen as hostile, like as you pointed out. But that could be another avenue to ask questions. That's wonderful.
Okay, cool.